Welcome back to Whispers in the Dark. I have a story for you about isolation, about the way darkness can change a familiar place into something ancient and hungry, and about how some shelters are worse than the storms outside them. This is a story of a man who went into the mountains looking for peace and found something that had been waiting a very long time for someone to lose their way. Now let's begin. A hiker decided to go on a hike by himself, something he was not very used to. His name was Evan Mercer, and he was 32 years old, broad-shouldered, healthy enough to convince himself he was prepared for a solo trek, and lonely in the quiet, airless way a person can be lonely without ever admitting it out loud. He lived in a small apartment on the edge of the city, worked at a desk under white fluorescent lights, and spent most of his weekdays listening to the sounds of keyboards and forced laughter drifting over office walls. The mountains had always seemed like an answer to a question he could not quite form. They were old enough to ignore him, vast enough to make his problems feel small, clean in a way the city never was. Usually when he went hiking, he did so with friends. There had been 4 of them once, then 3, then 2, until schedules shifted, people got married, Bobbies were born, jobs changed, and excuses piled up like fallen branches after a storm. This trip had started as another group plan. By Thursday, everyone else had backed out. Evan had almost done the same. He had stood in his kitchen on Friday night, staring at his packed day bag on the chair, wondering if driving 3 hours into the mountains alone was reckless or pathetic. In the end, he went because staying home felt worse. He left before dawn. The road into the range wound between dark slopes and low drifts of mist. The sun rose slowly behind the ridges, laying a pale wash of pink and gold over the treetops. Fir and pine crowded the mountainsides. In the valleys, old birch trees stood pale and still like bones under skin. The world looked untouched, the sort of landscape that made people speak softly without knowing why. Evan parked at a gravel lot beside the trailhead, shouldered his pack, checked his water, protein bars, first aid kit, flashlight, map, and phone. There was no signal. He had expected that. He locked the car, slipped the key into the small zipped pocket of his shorts, and started down the path. At first, everything was exactly what he had hoped for. The trail was narrow, but well marked, packed down by seasons of boots. Ferns feathered out on either side in lush green fans. Moss climbed over stones and roots, thick and velvety. Overhead, the branches knitted together and filtered the morning sun into shifting pieces of silver and gold. Birds moved through the canopy. Somewhere deeper in the trees, a woodpecker tapped with rhythmic patience. The air smelled of damp bark, pine resin, wet earth, and the faint mineral scent of distant water. He walked for hours and felt better with each one. The first stretch took him up a gentle incline where the forest was open enough for shafts of light to reach the ground. Then the trail tightened and bent along the shoulder of a ravine. He crossed a stream cold enough to numb his fingers when he dipped them in. He ate lunch on a flat stone overlooking a valley striped with shadow and sunlight. And for a while, he simply sat there listening to the wind move over the ridges. It felt good to have no conversations, no notifications, no clocks beyond the sky itself. He noticed small things. A line of mushrooms pale as ears sprouting from a dead log. The print of a deer pressed cleanly into mud. A hawk circling above the trees. Once he found an old blaze carved into a trunk, nearly swallowed by bark growth, a mark from hikers long gone. He even laughed at himself for having hesitated about the trip. The mountains were not threatening. They were indifferent. There was comfort in that. The whole day was normal. Trees and bushes engulfed his surroundings. He enjoyed being outdoors in the mountains. Nothing seemed strange to him. That was until he was making his way back to his car. He checked the time on his phone. Nearly 8 hours had passed. He figured an 8-hour hike was good enough. The sun had already started to drop, flattening into a dull orange band behind the western slopes. The light in the forest changed quickly after that, warmth draining from the trunks and leaves, shadows thickening between the roots. He turned around and began retracing his steps. At first, he moved with confidence. He remembered the stream crossing, the fork with the leaning cedar, the stretch of trail that opened onto the ridge. But the woods on the return seemed subtly wrong. Not dramatically, just enough to scrape against his certainty. The ravine appeared on the opposite side of the path, from where he thought it should be. The old blaze, he remembered, was not on a fir, but on a smooth gray trunk he did not recognize. He came to a fork he swore he had not seen before. There was no signpost. Both branches looked equally worn. He stood there for nearly a minute, turning slowly, trying to summon some perfect memory from hours earlier. Nothing came. The sky was already getting dark, and he needed to get back fast. He chose the left path because the ground seemed more compacted, and he told himself he was only tired. What was odd was how much he did not recognize the trail back. The trees thickened until the path narrowed to little more than a line of flattened needles. The undergrowth pressed close. Branches snagged his sleeves. The forest floor became uneven, broken by roots that rose like coiled ropes from the earth. He walked faster and then slowed, because moving too fast in failing light was how ankles got broken. He checked his phone again, though he knew there would be no signal. The battery had dropped under 30%. He began to panic, the kind of panic that starts as heat in the chest and then spreads into the limbs, making them heavy and clumsy. Every direction looked the same. Dark trunks, tangled brush, stone, fern. The sun vanished entirely behind the mountains, and the last natural light bled away as if the forest itself had drunk it. Night had already taken over, and all he had was a flashlight and no clue on how to get back. The beam from the flashlight was thin and weak. He had not replaced the batteries since winter. It cut a pale tunnel through the dark, but left the edges of everything trembling and uncertain. Beyond that circle of light, there was only depthless black and the constant sound of the woods shifting around him. Branches creaked. Leaves whispered. Something small scurried once through the brush and vanished. He stopped walking. He knew it was already too late and too dangerous to keep going through the perilous forest. He tried to think clearly. The first rule was not to wander blindly. People died that way. They broke a leg on a slope, fell into water, walked in circles until cold and exhaustion hollowed them out. He still had his jacket, still had some water, a little food. It would be miserable, but he could wait until dawn if he found some place out of the wind. That thought, that he might have no shelter for the night, settled over him like a second darkness. Then, almost luckily enough, he stumbled across a broken-down cabin. He saw it only when the flashlight beam struck glass. Not glass, he realized a second later. Something reflective nailed to a wall. He stepped closer, and the shape rose from the woods with such suddenness that he physically recoiled. It stood in a small clearing smothered by trees, as if the forest had grown around it and then forgotten to finish swallowing it. The cabin was squat and narrow, with a sagging roof, rotted porch boards, and walls of dark timber silvered by years of rain. One shutter hung loose. The windows were so dirty they reflected only the flashlight. Vines crawled up one side and disappeared beneath the eaves. The chimney leaned slightly, giving the whole structure a tired, listening posture. It was dark and seemed like no one had visited it in years. Still, it was the only man-made shelter he had seen in hours. Relief came first, immediate and almost dizzying. Whatever this place was, abandoned hunting shack, old ranger outpost, some forgotten seasonal cabin, it had a roof. It would keep out the wind. Maybe there would even be blankets inside. Maybe a stove. Maybe nothing more than dry floorboards. Even that would be enough. He approached the porch carefully. The wood groaned under his weight. One board cracked at the edge and sent splinters skittering into the weeds below. Up close, the front door was scarred and swollen with age, the paint long since peeled away. Rust spidered across the knob. The smell around the place was strange, not just mildew and rot. There was something sweeter under it, sweet in the way overripe fruit is sweet. In the way old meat can smell sweet right before the stink turns unbearable. He frowned and lifted his hand. He knocked on the door a few times, but no one answered. He waited, listened. No movement inside. No footstep. No voice. The woods behind him had gone so still he could hear his own breathing. He let himself in. The door opened inward with a long wooden complaint. His flashlight beam swept over a single room and stopped. Strangely enough, a perfect bed fitted for one person awaited him in the center. Not just a mattress thrown onto a frame. A real bed, narrow but neatly made. White sheet tucked tight. Gray wool blanket folded with care at the foot. One pillow, plump and clean looking despite the decay all around it. The rest of the cabin was in ruin. A table in the corner leaned on 3 legs. A cast iron stove crouched against one wall, rust blooming across its surface. Shelves had collapsed. Jars lay broken under dust. Cobwebs bridged the ceiling beams in thick ropes. Yet the bed looked untouched by time, almost luminous in the weak flashlight beam. It made his skin crawl. He stepped inside fully and called out, voice louder than he intended. "Hello?" No answer. He swung the light around again. There was only the one room. No hallway. No loft that he could see. A trapdoor maybe, half hidden under debris in the far corner, but no obvious sign of recent life. The air inside was colder than outside and far stiller. It smelled of mildew, mouse droppings, rotten wood, and that same faint, sweet undertone, richer here, almost syrupy. He knew that if the owner came back, he could explain himself. He was sure that the owner would not mind, or was even probably dead. He tried the bed with a careful hand. The sheet was dry. Cold, but dry, not dusty. He could not explain that. The pillow smelled faintly of lavender beneath the rot. Exhaustion overruled unease. He set his bag by the bed, kept the flashlight close, took off his boots, and lay down without removing his clothes. His body ached from the day. The mattress sank around him with unsettling softness. Overhead, the rafters disappeared into shadow. As he tried to sleep, he could not ignore the collection of paintings around the room. He had not noticed them at first, because the flashlight had passed over them too quickly. But once he lay still, his eyes kept snagging on the pale ovals of faces in the dark. Portraits. They lined the walls from shoulder height almost to the ceiling. Not framed photographs. Painted portraits in heavy dark frames. There were at least a dozen of them. Men, women, children, all rendered in old-fashioned brushwork, their features slightly too sharp, their skin drained to waxy shades of pearl and gray. Strange-looking people all peering at him, each wearing a smile that sent chills up his spine. The smiles were not warm. They were not even truly happy. They were stretched and thin, as if painted by someone who knew the shape of a smile without understanding the feeling behind it. Their teeth showed too evenly. Their eyes were the worst part. Flat, fixed, reflective in the flashlight beam as if the paint were still wet beneath the dust. He sat up and swept the flashlight around the room. Each face seemed to change, depending on the angle of the light. One elderly woman had a mouth so tightly stretched it looked stapled open. A young boy with combed black hair held a dead rabbit by the hind legs, its head dangling down against his coat. A stern man in a black suit had one hand resting on the back of a chair, but where the chair should have been was only darkness, a patch of paint worked so thick and black it seemed to sink into the wall. A girl no older than 8 wore a white dress with a dark stain blooming across the front. At first, he thought it was Shadow. Then he realized the stain had been painted red once, before time browned it. The cabin was silent. Then he heard a knock on the door. It was soft, 3 taps. Evan froze. Another 3 taps came, slightly louder. He stared at the door. His heart began to hammer so hard it hurt. The knock came a 3rd time, slow and deliberate, as if whoever stood outside knew exactly how frightened he was becoming and wanted to savor the wait between sounds. He grabbed the flashlight and rose from the bed. When he went to look, no one was there. The porch stood empty beneath the trees. The clearing beyond was filled with darkness and vertical trunks. The flashlight reached only so far. Past the edge of the clearing, the woods became a wall again. Then he saw movement. Figures in the tree line. Not one, several. They stood between trunks just at the edge of the beam, pale-faced and motionless. Human-shaped, but too still. The light caught the suggestion of shoulders, heads, long arms hanging at their sides. Before he could focus on them, they slipped back behind the trees and disappeared. A cold wave passed through him from scalp to heel. "Hello," he called, and the word cracked in his throat. "Is someone out there?" No answer came. Only the sound of a branch creaking somewhere high above, and then a faint scrape, as if something with hard nails dragged itself across bark. He shut the door and backed away from it. The cabin seemed smaller now. The dark corners deeper. The paintings watched. He considered leaving. The idea of staying suddenly felt insane. But the darkness beyond the walls was nearly complete, and his flashlight had begun to dim at the edges. If those figures in the trees were people, he did not want to meet them outside. If they were not people, he wanted to be even farther from them. He sat back on the bed and kept the flashlight aimed at the door. Minutes passed, or longer. Time changed shape inside that cabin. The beam weakened another degree. He drank a small sip of water and tried to control his breathing. Somewhere beneath the floorboards came a tiny intermittent sound, like fingernails clicking against wood. Scratch, pause, scratch, scratch. He looked toward the far corner, where the broken debris half covered what might have been a trapdoor. The sound stopped the instant he focused on it. He stood again and moved closer, each step careful. Dust shifted beneath his socks. The boards here felt colder. He crouched and brushed away splintered wood and dead leaves. There was a square outline in the floor, a ring handle, black with rust. A cellar. He stared at it. The sweet smell was stronger here. He recoiled, throat tightening. Something in his gut told him not to open it. Some old animal part of him that recognized bad places before the mind could explain why. He backed away and returned to the bed. The first real scream came a few minutes later. It cut through the forest so suddenly and so close that he almost dropped the flashlight. It was not an animal. He knew enough of the woods to tell that. No fox, no bobcat, no owl call distorted by distance. It was human, or something close enough to human to make no difference in the dark. High and ragged and full of pain. It seemed to go on far longer than lungs should allow, then snapped off all at once. After that, there was silence. Then a wet, dragging sound crossed the porch outside the door. Something heavy being pulled. Evan stood absolutely still. The flashlight trembled in his hand. He heard the scrape pause directly outside. A low, muffled thump hit the door, as though whatever was being dragged had rolled gently against it. A voice spoke from the other side. "Help me." It was a woman's voice, thin and breathless. "Please," she whispered, "please let me in." Every instinct in him surged toward the door. But there was something wrong with the voice. Not in its fear, in its cadence. Each word sounded separated from the next, rehearsed, as if the speaker were reading them off a page she did not understand. "Help me. Please let me in." Then very softly, right beside the crack between the door and frame, another voice murmured in a child's tone. "He is inside." Evan stumbled backward. Something tapped the window to his right. He turned the flashlight. A face was pressed against the glass. For one terrible second, he saw it clearly. A woman, or the shape of a woman, with skin so white it seemed stretched from candle wax, hair hanging in wet ropes around a long, narrow face, and eyes too large for the sockets, black-centered and glassy. Her smile ran almost to her ears. Her lips were gone, not torn, gone, as if carefully removed to reveal her gums and all her teeth. Then she slid sideways out of view without a sound. Evan cried out and backed into the bed frame. The knock began again, not at the door this time. From inside the walls, 3 taps to his left, 3 to his right, 3 from behind him where no wall opening existed. The cabin answered itself with hollow echoes. The portraits on the walls looked brighter in the wavering beam, more alert, more interested. He turned toward the nearest painting, the old woman with the stretched smile. Her eyes were different, not painted different, looking different. When he had first seen her, she had been facing slightly left. Now she was looking straight out of the frame. He stared until his eyes watered. Surely he was wrong. Surely fear was twisting everything. Then the boy, holding the rabbit, blinked. It was a tiny movement, just a darkening and clearing of the pupils. So small he might have imagined it. The rabbit in his hands twitched. Evan made a sound that was part gasp, part sob. He stumbled toward the door, deciding he would rather die in the woods than stay another second in the cabin. But before he reached it, the floor beneath him thudded hard from below. The trapdoor ring jerked once, then again. Then the entire cellar door bulged upward, as though something underneath had struck it with a shoulder. Dust leaped from the seams. Another hit. The ring rattled wildly. Evan backed away so fast he nearly fell. The flashlight beam bounced across the room. Everywhere it touched, the portraits had changed. The little girl in the stained white dress now had both hands clasped around something long and pale. A bone. The man in the black suit was no longer resting his hand on darkness, but on a door, painted in thick black strokes with a red line of light around its edges. And in the deepest part of that painted darkness, several eyes glimmered. The trapdoor burst open, not fully. One side jammed under the debris, but it opened enough for a smell to flood the room so vile and intimate that Evan gagged and dropped to one knee. It was not simple rot. It was layers of death packed together. Sour blood, mold, old excrement, meat liquefying in heat, wet fur, sweetness so thick it became nauseating. He clamped his sleeve over his nose and mouth, retching dryly. From the black square beneath, the floor came a sound like someone inhaling through a throat full of fluid. Then a hand appeared, human in shape, enormous, skin hanging off it in strips like soaked paper. The nails were thick yellow claws. It gripped the edge of the opening and squeezed hard enough to make the wood groan. A second hand rose beside it. Then a face pushed into view. At first his mind refused to arrange the features. It was too much at once. A head too large for the body, hair sparse and colorless, one eye hanging lower than the other as if the flesh around it had softened and slipped. The nose torn away entirely, leaving two black holes. The mouth wider than seemed possible, opening not downward, but almost to the sides, full of little pointed teeth crowded in uneven rows. Its skin looked half flayed. In places muscle showed wet and fibrous beneath it. It hauled itself upward with jerking hunger. Behind it, lower in the dark, other faces moved. Evan found his legs and ran for the door. The knob would not turn. He twisted it with both hands, threw his shoulder against the wood, kicked near the latch. Nothing. It held as if nailed shut from the outside. Behind him, he heard the thing from the cellar climbing free, its limbs making thick, wet sounds against the boards. He spun and raised the flashlight just as the beam died to a dim amber dot. In that weak light, he saw the creature standing between him and the bed. It had once been a man, perhaps, or parts of several men worked together badly. Its torso was long and naked, ribs visible beneath skin marked with old bites and cuts. The arms hung past the knees. The fingers ended in black crescents. Its legs bent wrong, the joints swelling outward like those of a deer. Across its chest, someone had sewn patches of cloth directly into the flesh. Little squares of floral fabric, flannel lace, all gone dark with fluids long dried and rewetted. It smiled at him. Behind it, one by one, the portraits opened their mouths. A sound poured from the walls. Not voices exactly. Breath and whisper, and the wet rubbing of tongues against dry teeth. Names maybe, prayers maybe, he could not tell. The thing took one step toward him. The floorboards creaked at the window. He glanced sideways and saw more faces peering in. Men and women and children with the same lipless smiles, their eyes reflecting the last ember of his flashlight. The creature from the cellar tilted its head, When it spoke, the voice came out layered, many throats trying to shape the same sentence. You found the bed. Evan snatched the iron poker from beside the rusted stove and swung with every ounce of strength he had. The metal connected with the side of the creature's head in a dull, cracking blow. It staggered, one eye bursting in a gush of dark fluid that sprayed the floorboards and the blanket on the bed. The smell intensified instantly, coppery and putrid. It shrieked. The sound was so loud and raw that pain stabbed through Evan's ears. He swung again. This time, the poker buried itself across the thing's mouth, knocking teeth free. They pattered across the floor like seeds. And then the creature laughed. Not from one throat, from everywhere. From beneath the floor, from outside the windows, from the frames on the walls. The portraits were moving now with hideous slowness. Hands pressing against the inner surfaces of the canvas, as if there were depth behind them. Faces bulging outward, painted mouths stretching wider. The little girl in the white dress pushed one hand through her own portrait and extended it into the room, her fingers long and wet, dripping black paint that struck the floor like blood. Evan ran to the nearest window and smashed the glass with the poker. Cold air flooded in. He threw himself halfway through the frame and met a grip like steel around his wrist. A woman stood outside, the same pale face he had seen at the window. Up close, she was far worse. The skin of her cheeks had split back to the jaw hinges. Beetles crawled slowly in the dark, wet sockets where her lips should have been. Her teeth sank into the sleeve of his jacket and kept going into the flesh of his forearm. He screamed and yanked back. The bite tore free a strip of skin. He dropped to the floor inside the cabin, clutching his arm as blood sheeted down over his hand. The woman outside shoved at the broken frame, trying to force herself through, her shoulders cracking and compressing with ugly popping noises. More hands appeared behind her in the dark, helping. The cellar thing lunged. It struck Evan in the chest and drove him backward over the bed. The mattress collapsed beneath his weight. The creature landed on top of him, its skin slick and cold as pond frogs, its breath a blast of grave rot. He jammed the poker up under its chin. Its teeth snapped inches from his face. He had never been so aware of his own body. The strain in his arms, the hot flood of blood from his forearm, the pressure crushing his ribs, the stink of the thing's mouth. He shoved until his shoulders screamed. The poker slid higher into the roof of the creature's mouth. Dark blood spilled over his hands, thick and oddly warm. The thing bit down on the iron and twisted. The poker tore free from Evan's grip and clanged across the floor. Its face descended toward his. Then all at once it paused. Its ruined head turned slightly, listening. So did everything else in the cabin. The hands emerging from the portraits froze. The woman, halfway through the window, stopped moving. Even the whispers in the walls fell silent. From outside, deep in the forest came the sound of a bell. One hollow note, then another. The creature on top of him shuddered with something like anticipation. It leaned close enough for Evan to see little threads of black saliva joining its teeth. He heard feet on the porch, slow steps. The door, which had refused to open for him, creaked inward by itself. Something entered. Evan could not see it clearly from where he lay pinned on the bed. He saw only a shape at first, tall, stooped, wrapped in what might once have been a long coat or robes of hide. It carried a lantern whose light was wrong, too yellow, too thick, as if made from rendered fat. In that glow, the entire cabin changed. The walls darkened to old brown stains. The portraits looked fresh, wet, newly painted. The creature on the bed climbed off him at once and bowed its head. Every face at the window lowered. The hands in the portraits withdrew. The figure with the lantern stepped forward until the light fell across its face. It had no eyes. The skin there was smooth and sealed over, as if wax had been dripped across empty sockets again and again until all detail vanished. Its nose was only a shallow ridge. Its mouth, however, was perfectly formed and very red. Too red, human red, living red. Beneath the coat, strips of something pale were stitched together to make sleeves. Human skin, Evan realized with a sickness that nearly made him black out. Skin covered in freckles, moles, bits of faded tattoo, harvested in panels. The eyeless thing tilted its head toward him. Its mouth opened. "Such a good bedfellow," it said softly. The voice was gentle, cultured, almost affectionate. Evan tried to crawl backward, but there was nowhere to go. The figure set the lantern on the table and reached out one long hand. The fingertips were stained dark, as though permanently dyed by blood. It touched Evan's wounded arm and smiled as fresh blood ran over its knuckles. "Lost ones always arrive tired," it murmured, frightened, grateful. That is the kindness of the mountain. It sends them hollow and ready. Evan lashed out with his uninjured hand and struck the thing across the face. Its head moved with the blow, then returned slowly to center. The smile remained. "Very good," it whispered. "The lively ones make the room beautiful." The cellar creature seized Evan's ankles. Before he could kick free, two more things swarmed from the opened trapdoor. They were smaller, shaped like children, but hairless and bloated. Their skin stretched shiny over ribs and swollen bellies. Their mouths split their faces too wide. They clambered onto the bed and pinned his arms with impossible strength. Their fingers felt like bundles of cold worms. He screamed and bucked and bit one of them hard enough to tear flesh from its wrist. It did not even flinch. The eyeless figure withdrew a knife from inside its coat. Not a hunting knife, something older, long and narrow, with a bone handle polished dark by use. Dried reddish-brown crust ringed the base of the blade. Evan begged then. Shame vanished under terror. He promised money. He promised silence. He wept. He called for help from anyone or anything that might hear. The cabin listened without pity. The figure placed the knife against the center of his chest, over his shirt. No, it said after a moment. Not first. It slid the blade down and cut open his pant leg from thigh to knee. The cold air touched his skin. Then the knife did. There are pains the mind rejects, sensations too intimate and bright to fit into thought. When the blade entered the muscle of his thigh, Evan's body convulsed so violently the bed frame cracked beneath him. He heard his own scream rise, break, continue. The knife carved a long opening. Heat flooded down his leg. The eyeless figure reached in with 2 fingers and spread the wound wider, studying the flesh beneath like a craftsman judging grain. Strong, it said, good color. One of the child things bent down and lapped at the blood streaming off the mattress. The figure began to cut pieces, not carelessly, not in frenzy, with expertise, small deliberate slices from the outer thigh, lifting strips of flesh that made the world go white at the edges of Evan's vision. He smelled his own blood and something worse, a hot butcher shop stink rising from his opened body. Each removed piece was handed behind without looking. The creatures took them eagerly. He could feel them chewing. He could hear the soft, wet snapping of his own flesh between their teeth. At some point, he lost consciousness. When he came back, the lantern still burned. His throat felt ruined. He could no longer scream above a rasp. The pain in his leg had become a universe. He looked down and saw strips missing from the muscle, a butchered red hollow glistening in the wrong light. Something white showed deep within. Bone. He sobbed weakly. The eyeless figure had moved onto his arm. The bitten forearm was split wider, peeled back. It worked around the wound with the same calm attention, separating skin from muscle. It was making something, sewing as it went. He turned his head and saw what hung from the wall beside the door. A new canvas, stretched over a frame, not blank, covered partly in skin. Human skin stitched smooth, the freckles and pores visible. One patch bearing the blurred blue remains of a word from an old tattoo. The eyeless thing was building a surface to paint on. The portraits were not paintings. He understood then. Not entirely. They were people preserved in pieces. Faces painted over faces. Pigment mixed with blood and marrow, and oils rendered from flesh. Each portrait a memory made from what remained of someone who had slept in the bed. The owners of the smiles on the walls had all been lost here, and outside the cabin, in the tree line, more waited. He began to pray, though he had not prayed in years. Not for rescue, for death, for quickness, for forgetting. The eyeless figure hushed him like a mother soothing a child. Not yet, it said. You have such expressive eyes. It took the knife to his abdomen. This time he watched. Shock had changed the pain into something distant and enormous, less a sensation than a condition. The blade opened him below the ribs. Warmth spilled over his sides. The figure parted him with both hands. Steam rose in the lantern light. Something slid wetly onto the sheet beside him. He recognized it only by color and movement. A loop of his own intestine, slick and pink-gray, writhing slightly with the last automatic contractions of his body. The child things shrieked with delight. One bit into the loop and pulled. Evan felt a deep, impossible tug from inside himself, and finally truly screamed again, though no sound came out but a bubbling wheeze. The eyeless figure frowned. No manners, it told the children. This one is for the room. It cut the bitten piece free and draped the remaining length over a chair like festive ribbon. Evan's vision pulsed black. He would have died then, perhaps should have, but the figure knew too much about keeping bodies present. It poured something between his lips from a small bottle, bitter and burning. His heart thundered painfully on. Outside, the bell rang again. The eyeless figure turned toward the open door and smiled. "They are gathering," it whispered. "Good, let them see." More of them filled the clearing now. Evan could glimpse them through the broken window and open doorway, dozens of pale forms between the trees, some tall and thin as saplings, some crawling, some wearing tatters of old clothing, some naked, their bodies stitched and mended from many dead things. They stood in reverent silence, facing the cabin as if attending a service. The figure raised its bloody hands, and the gathering answered with a low collective hum. Then the painting began. It was the worst part. Not the cutting, not the feeding, not even the realization that he was beyond saving. It was the slow transformation of his suffering into composition. The eyeless thing mixed pigments in shallow dishes. Dark reds, yellow whites, blacks so rich they seemed to absorb the lantern glow. It used brushes made from hair tied to finger bones. It looked from Evan to the waiting skin canvas and back again. Every time his face contorted in pain, the brush moved faster. The children adjusted his head, pried his eyelids wider, arranged his mouth. The creature from the cellar held his shoulders with both hands and kept him propped upright against the broken bed so the artist could study him. He saw the portrait emerge, his own face, not as he was, but as the room would remember him. Eyes wide and wet, lips peeled back from teeth, skin pale with blood loss. A look of pleading frozen at the moment before hope extinguishes entirely. Behind the painted version of him, the artist added trees, thin black trunks, between them, smiling faces watching. At the center of the background, it painted the bed white and inviting. The final touch was a slash of bright color across the lower corner. At first, he did not understand what it represented. Then he followed the artist's gaze to the ragged, opened ruin of his thigh and realized it had painted a little ribbon of exposed muscle, as if signing the work with a memory of the first taste. By then, he could no longer feel his feet. The room had grown very cold. His blood soaked the mattress, and dripped through it to the floor in a slow, rhythmic patter. The portraits on the walls seemed fuller now, satisfied. Some had fresh glints in their eyes. The new canvas was set leaning near the door to dry. The eyeless figure crouched in front of him. "Do you know why the bed is kept clean?" it asked. Evan could not answer. "Because kindness is the hook," it said. "Fear drives prey away. Comfort brings it close. The lost never trust the teeth first. They trust the blanket, the pillow, the promise of rest. That is why the mountain sends them here. It knows what every living thing wants in the dark." It touched his cheek almost tenderly. Then it slid the knife under his jaw. The cut was deep and final. Hot blood flooded over his collarbones. His breath filled with liquid. The room tilted. Sound receded as though he were already deep underwater. The last thing he saw as his vision collapsed inward was the portrait of the little girl in the stained dress. She was smiling at him, and now there was room beside her. Morning came bright and cold across the mountains. At the trailhead, Evan's car sat alone in the gravel lot. Dew silvered the windshield. No one noticed it at first. Hikers came and went. A couple with trekking poles mentioned to each other that someone must have started early. By noon, when the car was still there and no one had returned to claim it, a park volunteer checked the registration, made a note, and called it in. Search teams began the next day. They found traces of Evan throughout the woods. A wrapper from a protein bar near the ridge overlook. A boot print by the stream. A broken fern where someone had pushed through brush off trail. They found his flashlight 2 miles from the marked path, lying beside a patch of disturbed earth. The batteries were dead. The casing was slick, with something dark the rain had not quite washed away. There was no cabin, not according to the maps, not according to old records. Searchers combed the area where the flashlight had been found and discovered only dense forest, boulders, and one odd little clearing where the trees grew in a near-perfect circle around a patch of soft, sunless ground. In the center of that clearing, there was a depression, rectangular and shallow, as if something heavy had stood there once for many years before being removed. A volunteer claimed he smelled rot there so strongly he vomited. Another swore he heard knocking from underground. No body was recovered. Weeks later, deep in a section of forest closed to the public after a windstorm, a ranger found an object hanging from a bent nail driven into a pine. It was a painting. Rain had not damaged it. Dirt had not touched it. The frame was old dark wood. The portrait showed a man in hiking clothes sitting upright on a bed in a narrow room. His expression was one of unbearable terror, as though he were looking directly at something just beyond the viewer's shoulder. The detail was extraordinary, too extraordinary. Every eyelash, every pore. The wetness in the eyes looked real. The ranger took one look and dropped it. Later, when others came back with him, the painting was gone. Since then, people still disappear in those mountains. Not often enough for headlines, not in clusters large enough to close the park for long. Just one here, one there. A camper who leaves the firelight to relieve himself and never returns. A trail runner whose route tracker stops in a blank patch of forest where no trail exists. An elderly man picking berries who vanishes within shouting distance of his daughter. Searchers find scraps, a jacket sleeve, a snapped compass, bloodless shoe prints leading nowhere. And every now and then, among those who live near the range, stories move quietly from porch to porch and kitchen to kitchen. Stories of a broken down cabin no map will show. Stories of a single bed with clean sheets in a room full of smiling faces. Stories of knocks on the door after midnight. Stories of figures watching from the tree line. Some say if you ever find the cabin, you must never lie on the bed. Some say you must never look directly at the portraits. Some say if you hear the bell, you are already dead. And some, usually the oldest locals who speak only after several drinks and long silences, say the cabin is not a place at all, that it is a mouth, that the mountain itself grows it where it is needed, like a spider spinning a new web where flies are thickest. No one agrees on what waits inside, but everyone agrees on one thing. If the woods offer you comfort too easily, run. Run even if the dark tears your clothes on branches. Run even if roots break your ankles. Run even if voices behind you beg for help in the voices of women and children. Run until dawn or death, because there are fates in those mountains that do not end when the heart stops. There is one final part to the story, and it is the part I like least. A man from a nearby town claimed, years after Evan vanished, that he became lost on the same slopes during an autumn storm. He found the clearing. He found the cabin. He even stepped inside. But he did not stay. He said the room was filled with portraits, and though all of them were horrible, one in particular held him frozen where he stood. It was a painting of a man in hiking clothes seated on the edge of a bed, his throat laid open and his eyes shining with tears. The face was ghastly pale. The mouth hung slightly ajar. Yet the man's expression was not only fear. It was warning. According to the witness, the painted man's eyes moved. They shifted from the viewer to the bed, then back again. No other portrait moved, just that one. The witness fled immediately and somehow made it back to the trail by sunrise. He never hiked again. He never returned to the mountains. He drank himself into an early grave, insisting that some fragment of the man in the portrait had still been alive inside it, trapped there with all the others, forced to watch the room fill again and again. Maybe he was mad. Maybe the mountains did what mountains often do, and turned a lost man into a storyteller in order to frighten others away from dangerous terrain. Or maybe, on certain nights when the trees stand close and the wind is too still, there is a cabin somewhere in the dark with a bed kept perfectly clean for one more guest, and a wall of portraits silently praying that the next person through the door will be the one who finally burns the place down. If you ever hike alone, tell someone where you are going. Carry more light than you think you need. Turn back earlier than feels necessary. And if, in the deepest part of the woods, exhausted and frightened and grateful beyond reason, you stumble across a lonely cabin waiting just when you need it most, do not trust your luck. Some shelters are not mercy. Some lights are not meant to guide you home. Some smiles are only hunger wearing a familiar shape. Thank you for listening tonight. If this story pulled you in, leave a like, subscribe, and come back for the next descent into the dark. Until then, keep your doors locked, keep your flashlight close, and maybe, for your own peace of mind, stay out of the woods after sunset.
Whispers of a love so true, painting dreams of me and you. And I'll hold you close in this moment.